Welcome to the fifth in our series of lectures about justice, finding hope in hard times. Tonight, our speaker is Neva Hassanein, and she has a quite different sort of topic from any that we've had yet, and I'm really eager to hear her speak. I do want to say to you before that we have the beginnings of a schedule for the MCAT productions. That is that they will air on MCAT, that's Channel 7, on Tuesdays at 8:30 p.m. and Fridays at 5:30 p.m. That's going to begin on April 3rd and end on April 20th. But next week we'll have a handout for you with the schedules on it, so you don't have to worry about writing them down. But do remember to come next week and pick up a handout, so you'll be able to tell when each specific lecture is going to be telecast. As I said to you, our lecturer for today is Professor Neva Hassanein, and we know lots of things about her from her bio in the program. She came to us in 2000, and it's really one of the oddities of this university, which is not very big. I can't get this thing. Oh, there we go. Which is not very big. That I only really met Neva a week and a half ago. So there you go. That's why I come to these lectures. So I can find out what all my colleagues are doing. And it's been really exciting thus far. I'm sure it will continue to be. When I asked Neva to talk about how she became interested in issues of social justice, she told me that when she was an undergraduate, she went on a study abroad program in Kenya. And she began, as many people do, to confront the vast discrepancy between the economic life that she knew and the economic life which she saw around her in Kenya. And she began to ask herself the kind of questions which students often do when they're on study abroad programs. Why are things so different here? How is it that things are the way they are in my country and aren't the same way in this country, whether for better or worse? And that was really the beginning of her concern with social justice. She told me that also during the same trip she visited Egypt, that her father came from Egypt, and she went to the Aswan High Dam, about which many of us have heard, and we've all seen photos of it. But what she learned was that it had really effectively destroyed a centuries and maybe millennia old farming economy in Egypt. So one of those sorts of projects which is taken up in order to make a good change for some people and which turns out to have quite unforeseen consequences or consequences about which some people are not concerned in the beginning. She notes that now, for the first time in its history, Egypt imports most of its food. And being a classicist, I know that back in the good old days, Egypt used to feed Rome because the Romans couldn't feed themselves. So Neva, I'm looking forward a lot to hearing your lecture, and we'll do as usual. Neva will give her talk, and then we'll have some time for question and answer. Thank you, Professor Hassanein.
Good evening. Can you hear me in the back? Great, thanks. The process for developing the theme for this series is a little disconnected sometimes, but there's a lot of email back and forth about what are we really trying to get at. And the notion that we ought to bring in the idea of hope came into these discussions, and after we were settled on the title and so on, it reminded me of this quote by Howard Zinn, who is a late historian. Many of you may be familiar with Howard Zinn. He wrote the book The People's History of the United States, and I'm hoping that you can read it. I'm not going to take the time to read it. I put it up there as something to look at while you're sitting here, because I want to start with hope, because I'm going to come back to hope at the end. But Zinn's message is indeed a hopeful one. He's really encouraging us to recognize that the future is not inevitable, that it is created by, as he says, a succession of presents, okay? And I think that's a really good thing to keep in mind, especially during these hard times. and especially when one is looking at an issue such as food and agriculture. I'm going to stick pretty closely to my notes because as a couple of my students can attest to, I tend to stray. And if I stray too long on this topic, we'll be here for quite some time. So forgive me for that, but actually, you probably should thank me for that. And I often like to start my talks with this image of the bitterroot flower because it symbolizes how the indigenous people of this place made their living off the land. The Salish and other tribes survived for thousands of years by hunting and gathering foods. They followed complex patterns of movement, and they developed cultural practices that reflected their deep understanding of what was necessary for them to survive. In the spring, when a designated elder woman said it was time, they went to harvest the bitterroot before it flowered. So you didn't get any cues about that cute pink flower coming up. You had to know exactly where the plants were, what they looked like, and they're very small, as many of you probably know. The plant has to be dug during a very short period of time when it's easiest to dig and to peel, and when the roots have their highest starch content. They knew that. And from generation to generation, the Salish passed down local knowledge about when to harvest the roots and where to find them. They not only relied on the bitterroot, of course, they gathered and ate hundreds of different plants and hunted a wide variety of animals for food. These practices of food getting were critical to their survival. Right? Food could not be taken for granted. Today, most North Americans know very little about where their food comes from. They might say it comes from here. And for many people, it does, at least in the most direct way. And today, few of us know which foods can be harvested in the wild, where to find it, at what times, and how to preserve it. Most of us could no longer survive off the land as people who are native to this place once did. For most North Americans, our attention has drifted away from the source of food that keeps us alive. This shift in attention, though, is a very recent development in history. What we think of today as the global industrial food system that most of us tend to rely on really only began, depending on where you want to start your counting, it really began to be built in earnest only about 100 or 150 years ago. Yet in that time, the transformations have been tremendous. And symbolic of the fact that of these transformations is that the Super Walmart out on Reserve is located on what were once some of the best bitterroot hunting grounds in this valley. So let's look at another historical photo. I got a nice grin from my friend Jim Cusker there. He knows what this is. This is Hughes Gardens, a photo taken around the turn of the 20th century from Mount Jumbo. You can see the clock tower there, main hall. I teach in Rankin Hall. It wasn't even built yet. It was the second building on campus, I believe. But at that time, and then well into the 20th century, diverse farms like Hughes Gardens and a food processing industry provided much of the food that Missoulians ate and that was provided to the mining towns in the upper Clark Fork. Missoula earned the moniker the Garden City because of these large gardens, orchards, and truck farms that fed the people who lived here. We had fruit and sugar beet processing, meat packing, flour mills, dairies. We even had a potato chip factory, much of which is gone. So this photo, I persuaded a young photography graduate student to take for me from the same spot today, actually a few years ago. And it's also symbolic of a larger reality. The interstate cuts through what was once Hughes Gardens. It illustrates the larger changes that have occurred over the last century to create the modern world food system and the degree to which it has become dependent on fossil fuel. One of the central characteristics of today's food system is distance. While we've lost much of our local food production, we have grown increasingly dependent on food that comes to us from long distances away. The vast majority of the food we eat, about 90% or more of what Montanans eat, comes from someplace else. The same is true for nearly every other state in the nation. Walk into a supermarket, walk down the aisles, you can find food if you can find its origins, you can find food there that's come from many points across the globe, and not necessarily locally, even when it's in season locally. And a friend of mine, Jack Kloppenberg, likes to say, our food comes to us from everywhere and nowhere. Nowhere in particular, nowhere that we know in much detail. And the distancing I'm concerned about is not just that physical distance, but also the social distance that's been created in the modern food system. We know very little about the food we eat, the ecological and social conditions under which it was produced, how it reached our plate, and perhaps most importantly for a discussion on food justice, who controls the food supply? These are fundamental questions of sustenance and sustainability. Now, I'm just throwing this quick chart in here to let you know that when I use the word food system, I don't only mean agriculture. I mean a whole set of processes that occur from the point of production, including the natural resources upon which agricultural production rests, okay? Natural and human resources, on-farm and off-farm inputs, food production, food transformation, food distribution, food access, and consumption. Although a lot of, I will be talking quite a bit about agriculture per se, many of us are really concerned about the entire system and some of the problematics that I'll be discussing tonight run throughout the system. But of course, food is much more than a system, right? It is deeply personal. We literally take food into our body. It's one of the most intimate commodities that exists. It's also deeply cultural. Of course, societies have built traditions around food. The sharing of food among families and friends is a time-honored tradition. It's one of the ways that we interact with each other, and often in profound and memorable ways, sometimes good, sometimes bad. Depends on your family, I guess. See, I told you I shouldn't wander off. But food is not only important physically for all of our bodies and culturally, it is also, and maybe always has been, deeply political. All right. The need for food originally, and with the development of agriculture, required the creation of social relationships and coordination among different members of a society. Increased food production enabled people to generate surpluses, and in turn, those surpluses provided resources for the development of society and for political institutions. Indeed, agricultural policies are among the oldest and most significant forms of government intervention. So food is political. And another way to think about this idea is that the food system is also both a symptom and a symbol of how we organize society in other ways. In other words, it represents a microcosm of wider social realities. Now, although this has long been true, today's food fights, as the cover of this New York Times magazine shows, they reflect what might be, and has been described by a number of scholars, as a titanic struggle between the forces of control by a few and the pressure to democratize. In other words, the agri-food system has been and continues to be contested political terrain. Today, around the world, people are often rebelling against what is perceived to be an unjust food system. They're using political pressure to ensure greater access and collective benefit from the food system. The aim is to provide the means to eat adequately, safely, affordably, humanely, and in ways that one considers civil and culturally appropriate. Now, my teaching, research, and community service have focused on this struggle, and I'm particularly interested in social movements that have emerged around food and agriculture, especially in the last couple of decades. And tonight I want to try to do two things. I've narrowed it down to two. It's a very complex topic and so many interconnections. I'm going to try to go through this quickly so that we have time for dialogue. But the first thing I want to do is highlight just a couple of the reasons why these movements feel that the current system has become unjust. And unfortunately, there are many injustices in the food system that I'll not have time to discuss. But secondly, and perhaps most importantly, I want to explore with you how food has become an important space for individual and collective agency, the kind of agency and creativity that I think Howard Zinn was referring to in that quote that I showed at the beginning. In essence, all of these movements, and I'm going to talk about one at the global level and one that's working here at the local level, they're really basically calling for a much more democratic food system than we have today. In other words, these movements want to give people much greater say in decisions about something as important as the food we put into our bodies or feed our children every day. These contemporary movements use a variety of terms to articulate their demands. And these are powerful terms. And I'm still working out exactly what their differences and similarities are. But they're terms like food sovereignty, food justice, food democracy. These are strong terms. And they're really important ideas embedded within it. But fundamentally, it's about the idea that people can and should actively participate in shaping their food system rather than remaining passive spectators on the sidelines. We should have the power to determine agri-food policies and practices locally, regionally, nationally, and globally. Now, many of you in this audience are probably no doubt aware that we produce much more food today than we have in the past, and that has especially been the case over the course of the last 50 or 60 years. So hasn't the industrial food system been beneficial? Well, in many ways, it's a wonder. It's a remarkable. We've seen a tremendous increase in the amount of food that's produced in the world. Especially if you look at it on a per capita level, the number of food calories produced on Earth has increased by 13% in the last 30 years. Notice I said calories, that's important. But this is even while we've seen population increase during that period. World grain production has almost tripled since the 1960s. Given the great increase in world population over those 30 years, this represents a huge amount of increase in the total amount of food. And almost all of that increase has been the result of new technologies like pesticides, synthetic fertilizers, high-yielding seed varieties, and the like. It's not been the result of farming more land. We're pretty much farming all the land that's arable in the world already. This is this triumph of technology is clearest when we look at this one at this one measure, raw output. Okay, it's pretty dramatic. But of course, the availability of food does not mean that all people actually have access to it. Hunger and malnutrition are not really problems of production. The root causes are poverty and the lack of access to land. We had the dubious distinction a few years ago of reaching a point in time where the greatest number of people are hungry on the planet than ever before in human history. 1 billion people. Another 1 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies that are associated with malnutrition. And in the last several years, we've really seen food prices increase. It's fluctuated somewhat, but especially in the developing world, it's increased 50 to 80% since 2005. And I was going to include this, and I'll just make a side note about it because I think it's pretty fascinating to think about. There's a number of scholars who are arguing that the tipping point leading to Arab Spring last year was high food prices. I didn't plan on going into any detail on it because it's still not at all, certain that that's what really brought people out into the streets. But clearly, food prices were among the concerns that people have. As somebody who studies the environmental and environmental health impacts of agriculture, it's hard for me to leave out this slide, and even harder to leave out the detail. Oh, it went out. I got it in the wrong order here. I did? Ah, thank you. Appreciate it. Well, the other slide's important too. I'll get there. But there are a variety of environmental problems associated with the new technologies that have made the increases in agricultural production possible. And I'm not going to go into all of them. I'm happy to visit with you about it later if you like. But I think that they're really critical, and they raised important questions about the long-term sustainability of the industrial food system. So I'm just got them listed up there for you: soil erosion, loss of soil quality, high water usage, groundwater depletion, water pollution, high energy use, risk to farm workers, obesity. I mean, I don't probably have them all up there even. A wide variety of problems associated with industrialized agriculture. So despite its benefits, it's brought costs, externalities, that Dick Barrett might have called them. And as I mentioned, there's no new land for us to move to. So land is a limiting factor when it comes to food production. And I was really impressed by a recent UN report. It came out last fall in November that really did an assessment of the state of the world's land and water resources. They predict that in order to feed the 9 billion people that we're expected to have on the planet by 2050, the world's farmers would have to produce 70% more food to meet people's needs. Meanwhile, those increases in production that we've been seeing since I was born in the early 60s, those are slowing down, those rates of increase. And we've got competition for agricultural land for biofuels, coupled with climate change and other factors that have left key food-producing systems at risk of being unable to meet human needs in just 40 years' time. The UN has documented that 25% of the world's land, a quarter of the world's land, is highly degraded, and another 8% moderately degraded. And when they're talking about degradation, they're talking about combinations of soil erosion, water degradation, and biodiversity loss. So we're facing some pretty big challenges when it comes to providing sustenance for this growing world population. And while we've increased production, we've also increased global agricultural trade. I apologize, I wasn't able to find a more recent chart with these statistics, but I have no doubt that these trends have continued. This chart shows the value of agricultural trade in dollars over that 40-year period, it tripled. And it's not just a dollar value that's tripled, it's also increased dramatically in terms of the volume of agricultural trade, which has increased fourfold during this same period. It's a wonder we ever ate it all before this. Today, some 898 million tons of food are shipped around the globe each year. Indeed, food has come to account for a significant amount of total global commerce. And that's why, on average, you'll hear statistics like the food that was on your plate for dinner tonight, or is going to be after this talk, has traveled 1,300 to 1,500 miles to reach our plates. And there's a number of reasons why I think this is an underestimate, but that's the number you see out there. That's how far our food travels to get to us, for those of us who live in North America. So one of the major characteristics of the dominant food system then is that it comes to us from all points of the globe. And there's obvious benefits to that. If we go to the supermarket right now, we can probably find strawberries or beautiful red peppers or all sorts of products, olive oil from Italy, whatever. And there's benefits to that. But there's also certain problematics. And one of those is the energy that's required to move food around the globe, to produce food. This chart only shows the US food system, but you can see of all the 10.25 quadrillion BTUs, only 21% of those are used in agriculture. All the rest of it is used to transport, process, package, retail outlets, restaurants, and home refrigeration and preparation. And that's bigger than agricultural production. So some people want to say, well, you use more energy boiling your potatoes than I do on my farm. And there's, some element to that that's true. This food system is tremendously dependent on fossil fuel and on extensive transportation networks. We're not only depleting finite oil resources, but we're also contributing mightily to climate change. According to the International Panel on Climate Change, which is the panel of scientists from around the globe that won the Nobel Prize, including our own Steve Running, about a third of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to food and agriculture. A third. So this is pretty important stuff. So it raises questions again. How secure, how resilient is this system? And I would argue it's not all that secure. These are just some statistics from a few years ago regarding the importations of food into the United States. 9.5 million shipments in 1 year, 226,000 establishments around the world are registered to export food to the United States. And the number of on-site inspections of those establishments that were conducted by the Food and Drug Administration in that year was 200. The Food and Drug Administration has been notoriously under-resourced. Just in 2011, in the January of 2011, President Obama signed into law the first major overhaul of our food safety system since the 1930s. We have some catching up to do if we're going to depend on regulatory agencies to oversee this system and the safety of it. So who's benefiting? Well, you might say that we as consumers are benefiting, right? We appear to have this tremendous choice in the marketplace. But this brings me to one of the key issues that I want to spend a little more time on tonight, and that is this idea of who's controlling the food system. The typical supermarket contains about 30,000 different items. Half of those are produced by just 10, no, I can't do that, 10 multinational food and beverage corporations. 138 people form the boards of those corporations. These are some of the biggest corporations in the world, right? So it may appear that there's this tremendous choice. Oh, there's all these different products in the aisle. Well, actually, the differences are primarily in terms of marketing and flavoring and things like that. They aren't so much in terms of the raw materials that are used to produce food products. So it's really an important thing to recognize that when we go into a food store, there's just really, I mean, I won't say a handful, but 138 people making a lot of decisions about the food system, and doing so under a system that is driven, of course, by the profit. All of those corporations have an obligation to return a profit to their shareholders, and that is their top priority. So this is about as advanced theory as I'm going to get here. But one of the ways we think about this issue of control in any sector is called the concentration ratio. And this is a measure that describes the portion of a total market share that's held by the largest 4 firms. Sometimes it's 5, depending on the data that are available. So economists and sociologists have shown that if 4 firms control 40% or more of a market, that market is losing or has lost its competitive character. This is not just an issue of economic power, so for things like pricing and so on, right? Because the concern with having that concentration with respect to pricing is that if only a few actors are really observing and influencing the market, they don't need to collude, right? They can observe each other and basically get enough information to set prices accordingly, to lose that sense of competition. But the other piece of it is it's not just that concern about the economic power, but about ownership, concentration of ownership. Do we really want to have all of our proverbial eggs in such a few baskets? And I'll let you decide that. I'm not sure I do. And I'm not afraid to say that. I think this is deeply problematic. And I will say that people who have been working on agricultural issues over the last several decades, in fact, I cut my teeth on these issues back in the late 80s, working with farmers and ranchers in eastern Montana. We're looking at concentration issues in the beef packing industry. They've been calling for an investigation by the Justice Department for decades. Finally, with the Obama administration, those hearings and that process of investigation is underway for the first time in my lifetime. And why should we investigate it? Well, because in agriculture and the foods and various food sectors, the degree of concentration is profound. Now, these are the most recent data available. I'm not just lazy here. In fact, this is very hard information for people to get. You have to really comb through all the trade magazines and try to identify who's buying who and so on, and who's selling who, and what does that do to their market share. But in beef packing, which is deeply important to the state of Montana, 83% of the market is controlled by 4 firms, one of which is now owned by a Brazilian company. Pork packing, 66%. Broiler chickens, 58%. Turkeys, 55%. Soybean crushing, 80%. The top 5 grocery retailers is 48% in 2006. And that is particularly difficult type of information to get because grocers often sell many other things as well, and separating out food sales from the other retail items can be difficult. So obviously we're a little bit beyond 40% in most of these sectors. Increasingly, the same firms process many different commodities and control a variety of links in the chain. So ConAgra ranks in the top 4 firms in the processing not only of beef, and not only the ownership of beef feedlots, but also pork packing, lamb, turkey, flour milling, dry corn milling, and seafood. Oh, I said ConAgra, it's Cargill. And the 5 largest retail supermarkets, just in 1997, the 5 largest controlled 24%, and that figure nearly doubled by 2006. So with globalization, we have opened up borders to nations, borders of nations to corporations whose primary aim is to increase profits. And so in this system, the biggest players survive. This type of concentration is why we no longer have many beef packing plants in Montana. Although we used to, food processing used to be a #1 job sector in our state. It's almost gone now. We barely even track it in the census. So we have a system that largely, it works in favor of these entities, and we'll in a few weeks, when we send off our tax payments, we'll be supporting subsidies, among other things, subsidies to farmers, which is not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself, except it's really subsidies to Cargill, because we're making up the difference by allowing those corporations to buy these bulk raw materials cheaply on the market. Concentration has risen dramatically in the seed industry, okay, and so this concentration of ownership in the seed industry is especially disconcerting because seed, germplasm, is the basis of all agriculture. And this is a chart done by my colleague Phil Howard at Michigan State, and he does these great graphics, which you can just download if you want to look it up. But you can see the balloons show you the size of market share, relative market share that these companies have. And as you see, many of them are not just seed companies, they're chemical companies, they're biotechnology companies. And we've seen rapid consolidation, especially as biotechnology has come on the market. The top 4 biotech firms control nearly 50% of the global proprietary seed market in 2008. We all are eating genetically modified food, whether we know it or not. Mostly we don't know it because it's not labeled. In 85 to 93% of the major crops. The top 3 companies control 75% of corn. One company alone controls 30% of vegetable seeds. This is just a chart from some work that one of my former graduate students has been doing at the Organic Seed Alliance, and this shows the percentage of the total U.S. cotton, corn, and soy acreage that's planted in Monsanto, with Monsanto seeds that include their transgenic traits or genetically engineered traits. And it's pretty dramatic, right? So they're controlling almost completely all of the seed that's on these major crops. That seems problematic, not just to me, but also to people like Vandana Shiva, who is what I would call a public intellectual. She's in India, and she's questioned this kind of control repeatedly, and she is known for putting out sort of some pretty clear statements like this one on what she thinks about it, right? Seeds controlled by Monsanto, agribusiness trade controlled by Cargill, processing controlled by Pepsi and Philip Morris, retail controlled by Walmart. It's a recipe for food dictatorship. We must occupy the food system to create food democracy. So with this nod to Vandana Shiva, I'm going to turn now to look at, for a few minutes, of some of these social movements that have emerged. And these movements have emerged because they're not waiting for the conventional institutions to act to address the kinds of concerns that I've talked about so far. Peasants who still produce food for about 70% of the world's population. They see this dominant system as a war. They see it as a war against them. And they're organizing and they're speaking out across the globe. And an interesting organization that I know just a little bit about, read a book about with my graduate students last fall, is called La Via Campesina. And it was founded in 1993 by a group of farmers' representatives, women and men. They're very attentive to gender issues, from 4 different continents. They were concerned about agricultural policies and the ways that agribusiness were becoming globalized. And they felt there's a need to develop a common vision and articulate that vision for their own food sovereignty. That's the term that they use. They want to have their voice heard, and they are increasingly being heard by entities like the UN, let's see if I can say this correctly, the UN Special Rapporteur on the human right to food is taking their work very seriously. And they're participating directly in a number of global meetings that are occurring around agriculture. This movement brings together literally millions of peasants, that are small and medium-sized farmers, landless people, women farmers, indigenous people, migrants, and agricultural workers from around the world, defending small-scale sustainable agriculture as a way to promote social justice and dignity. They strongly oppose the corporate-driven agriculture and transnational companies that are destroying people and nature from their point of view. There are about 150 local and national organizations in Via Campesina now, from 70 different countries in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Altogether, this represents an estimated 200 million farmers. They try to be, in their own practice, try to demonstrate democracy, and as I said, be attentive to gender issues. Each region of the world that they've identified gets to have 2 people that represent them on the international board of Via Campesina. And I'm telling you this because there's always 1 man and 1 woman from each of the regions. And the woman is from Montana. And right now, and her name is Dina Hoff, and she farms with her husband out near Glendive. My students and I visited her a few years ago when we went out to rural Montana. And she's a tremendous woman. She got involved because she'd been previously a leader in the National Family Farm Coalition. So there's a tie, a Montana tie to Via Campesina. I just wanted to mention to you. And they have spent tremendous effort trying to articulate what it is food sovereignty could look like. And there's actually a whole book about it, and so I can't quite do it justice. But essentially, they are naming and recognizing this power that I've been talking about, this perceived injustice, perceived inequity in power about the food and agricultural system. And so they're calling for their rights and the rights of nations and peoples to control their own food systems. Seems like such a radical idea. And it is actually. It seems simplistic when I say it, but it actually is a radical idea today. And this statement, I don't know if you can, oh good, maybe you can read. This was a meeting they had a few years ago in Mali, and this image of this food sovereignty statement. I can't read it on my own version, so I have to. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agricultural systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies rather than the demands of markets and corporations, right? These people are recognizing profoundly that markets are not about equity, right? Markets, that's not what they do well, is produce equity. And yet food is too important to leave it up to those markets and those corporations. And there's a number of people, such as the folks at Food First and other organizations, that are working with peasants on the ground in communities around the world to improve the sustainability of these smallholder systems. And they're suggesting something that is quite different than the dominant neoliberal model. And they want to build it from the ground up. And they profoundly recognize that each nation has the right to produce its own food in its own territory, and that food sovereignty is a basic precondition, ultimately, for food security. Interestingly, I discovered the other night that 22 countries around the world have enshrined the right to food in their constitutions, either for all citizens or specifically for children. Food sovereignty is really, in a way, much more radical than just the human right to food. It's trying to get at just the control of the entire systems. But I think this is a pretty interesting idea, that these nations have actually included the right to food in their constitutions. The United States, by the way, has refused to sign on to the treaty that includes the human right to food. All right, 10 minutes. It's time for Lucy. All right, you guys probably know Lucy Brieger. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about some of the things that are happening here locally, because I would argue that the so-called local food movement, which isn't just about local food in the sense of physical proximity, but also about social relationships, as I mentioned earlier, is very similar to the kind of notions that the organizations involved in Via Campesina are talking about. In fact, the term food justice is also cropping up, and food democracy in many areas in the United States. So if the contemporary system is characterized by physical and social distance and by control by a few, the local food movements here in this country hopefully are characterized by proximity and by a diverse array of actors who are involved in participating and regaining power over something that's so central to our lives. There are a wide variety of initiatives here in Missoula and in western Montana. I have to say this is one of the most exciting places to be to work on these issues. And I'm just going to mention a few of them, but before I do, let me just say these are the kinds of things that people talk about when they talk about why we should go local, as it were, because it reconnects us to place and to community. Right? How many people knew Lucy Brieger when her picture came up? Yeah, a good number of you. You see? Yeah, that's a connection to place, to community, knowing where your food comes from. You have the potential to know about farming practices that are used in your community. And I'll just pause here to say, when I went to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, my advisor he's a leader in this field and looking at local food systems. And he was talking all about it and getting very excited. And I was like, yeah, but there's an Oscar Mayer Wiener plant down the road. It's local. And it drives a bus around town with a big wiener on the top of it. And, but there's nothing inherently ecologically sound by having food that's proximate, right? Or even healthy for us, right? So you have the potential to support good farming practices, good food preparation. You can reduce energy, keep money circulating in the community, reduce our reliance on a handful of companies, and a point I want to spend a little bit of time on in my last few minutes is thinking about our long-term food security, right? Because if you go back to those sort of depressing statistics I gave at the beginning about how much land is degraded, how many people are going to be joining us on the planet in the next 40 years, another 20 or 2 billion, it's important to think about our own food security here locally, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And I also believe that a key piece of food democracy, and that sort of local food is almost like a gateway drug, if you will, right? You taste that excellent peach or delicious tomato, and then you're not just hooked on that flavor or the knowledge that something about where you got it from, or that you spent the morning at the market seeing your friends. But you begin to ask questions about, well, why are those hard tomatoes in the grocery store? What was used on them? You start to ask a bunch of other questions about it. And my hope is that in that process and in our excitement about local food, that we would become better citizens. We would not be just food consumers, we would be food citizens that can engage in meaningful action, not just be passive recipients. Okay, local food, as I mentioned, can be tastier. It does not mean no trade. Fair trade we can talk about if you want, is an example of where you may have a vast physical distance, right? Fair trade coffee, for instance, and yet by the label being on there, knowing it was fair trade certified, you know certain things about how it was produced and what the producers received in return for their labor. And you can, in that sense, establish a social relationship even at a distance. There are a wide variety of strategies for change, and I'm not going to go into them because I just want to get on to discussing, actually want to get on to hearing your questions and stop talking. But this is pretty interesting. Just last fall, this came out. The USDA did an analysis and trying to figure out, well, what is this local food movement contributing to the economy? Of course, that's how we measure everything. And people were actually stunned to find out when you combine not just the direct, to consumer purchases, like if I might buy directly at the farmer's market, when you combine that with me buying local food through grocers or the University of Montana buying it for the farm to college program, those kind of intermediated channels, we grossed nearly $5 billion in 2008. So it's pretty interesting. These things are growing around the country. This is the latest statistics on farmers markets. In 1994, we had 1,755 farmers markets in the country. We're now up to over 7,100, almost 7,200 farmers markets across the country. People are really excited about this, and they get it, I think. And of course, it's important that we recognize, even though we may see that local food is a way to sort of bring together community shared values, that the community isn't homogeneous, right? We have different cultural traditions, we have different levels of income, and we really need to be attentive to this. And I think one of the best ways so far we've done this is through the creation of the Farmers Market EBT program, which makes it possible for those who are on food assistance to swipe their EBT cards, right, food stamps, it's now electronic, to swipe them at the market, get these little tokens, spend them at the market, and buy fresh food. And the really cool thing about it is, anybody goes up to the same stand with their credit card or debit card and gets these same tokens, so it eliminates stigma. It's not like, oh, you've got tokens, because lots of people are going there with tokens. And I tried to get more recent figures on what EBT is bringing into the farmers market. I was unable to get them. But the last time I heard a couple of years ago, about $25,000 in EBT tokens had gone through the Clark Fork River Market alone. So pretty cool. Missoula County residents spend a tremendous amount on food, about $300 million. What if more of those dollars stayed here? And in fact, we're seeing a rise in direct sales to consumers. In 1997, only 37 farms in the county sold food sales directly to to consumers for a value of $91,000. Just 10 years later, we had 68 farms. Oh, how'd that happen? Selling over $270,000 in food. So almost doubled. The dollar value almost tripled. So pretty interesting. Economic development opportunity. Sorry, the mayor's not here to include this in his economic development plan. One of the things I didn't get a chance to include in a slide, but a group of us who are working in western Montana, about 7 counties here in western Montana, brought an economist named Ken Meter out, who did an analysis of our food system locally. And so it looks at the western Montana region, and he found that if western Montana consumers purchased only 15% of the food they need for home use, okay, not your restaurant sales, but for home use directly from the region's farmers, this would produce $66 million of new farm income for the region. I mean, that's just 15%. That's, we're already at 10. Maybe, we should be able to up the number substantially. And it's, not about having, everything we eat be local, but we could just make tremendous change even by doubling what we do now. So I'm going to, just in the interest of time here, swoop ahead. Although Mark LaParco will be mad if I don't mention Farm to College program, bringing in about 20% of our food budget at the University of Montana is now being spent through the Farm to College program, which means Montana grown or processed. Folks bringing food from all over the state. And one of the cool partnerships in this is the Western Montana Growers Cooperative. I'm going to mention this because it's sort of under the radar for the average consumer. The Western Montana Growers Co-op is a producer and distributor cooperative for farmers. There are about 30 farmer members in it. And it's been going for about 8 or 9 years now, I think. It's very unique in the nation. And what they're doing is, basically pooling some of their produce. And they got a refrigerated truck, and they're taking it to markets, grocers, restaurants, and so on, wholesale markets. And it's a pretty neat deal. And they're actually in the black. So, and they're doing some neat partnerships with Charlie's Produce. So I'm not going to go into that. But anyway, I'm going to jump ahead here. And I'm going to, that's the Peas Farm. That's the Environmental Studies program runs a Peas Farm in partnership with Garden City Harvest. I feel our students are learning to be food citizens there, and we can talk more about that. The Community Food and Agriculture Coalition is a food policy council. There are now some 150 food policy councils across the country. And what these aim to do is to bring food to the public agenda at the local level, right? Most local governments pretty much ignore food. Right? We've got planning boards, we've got transportation boards, we've got public health boards, water quality, air quality, so on, right? Historic preservation. We don't have one on food. There's no department of food at the local level in any city in this nation. Local governments have relegated food to the national and international level. But we realize, and those of us who are involved in the Community Food and Agriculture Coalition, that we need to do some food systems thinking and doing. We need to develop new local and regional markets, help beginning farmers, build scale-appropriate infrastructure for processing and distribution, and there's some exciting things happening in that realm. Okay. I want to just kind of, the last issue I want to touch on before I wrap this up is farmland. And if I wasn't here tonight, I'd be at a planning board hearing. talking about yet another development that is going to eliminate farmland. Soil is the basis of agriculture, and we are blessed in this valley with some really nice soils and some really nice irrigation infrastructure, and yet we're losing it. Only about 8% of the land in Missoula County has good agricultural soils, and yet about 29,000 acres of agricultural land here has been converted to other uses just since the mid-1980s. So that's over 1,400 acres per day, and as my buddy Paul Hubbard likes to say, 3 football fields every day for the last 25 years. Now, this has slowed down a little bit in the last couple of years, but I have no doubt that this trend will probably continue unless we adopt some policies to save soil for the next generation. I see it as an intergenerational resource, something we should pass on, an issue of intergenerational justice, if you will. By destroying this farmland, we can't get it back. And we really need to find some new innovative models. I didn't touch that. Okay, but with Barbara Kingsolver will say it better than me. But okay, so she says, right, recall that whatever lofty things you might accomplish today, you will do them only because you first ate something that grew out of dirt. These are some Amish kids up. Oh, where'd they go? Steve. Okay, all right. I can't touch anything. We need to take care of the soil. It's not sexy. It's not like polar bears or grizzly bears, but it's the basis of all life, I would submit. And we can talk more about that. I'd love to visit. So, okay, local is delicious. Here's Steve Elliott. And it's only accident that I have both Steve and Lucy in this slideshow. It's delicious, it's exciting, it's inspiring. I mean, we've got tremendous students attracted to coming to school here now because they're just really jazzed about this opportunity to, and this idea of building community-based food systems. But is it more than that? Is it more than delicious? Are the goals and strategies of this movement, or Via Campesina for that matter, really strong enough to mount a serious challenge to the industrial agriculture and the dominant global food system? Is the local level really an appropriate place to focus our efforts when the problem seems so remarkably, right? Are we making any difference? Are we anything more than a minor irritant to global capital, if you will? I don't know. These aren't easy questions to answer, but my inclination is to answer them with a resounding yes. I do think that pragmatic, incremental change at the local level can, in the long run, result in transformation of the dominant food system. It's the only thing I can imagine that actually can. And so, as we try to regain power over something so central to our lives, the food we put in our body, the food that connects us to the natural world and to each other every day, whether we think of it or not, we can think about this notion not just of what we buy, but of building a food democracy. It's much more than the purchases we make, although those are important, of course. But we need to also create opportunities for giving people a say in their local food systems. We need to create meaningful opportunities for all citizens to be engaged in shaping these alternative systems. That's why, in these ways, food is both personal and political. And by recognizing this dual nature of food, we build pathways for environmental and social change by challenging the ways we think and the ways we talk about food. Through food, we can become closer, and we can engage people in these ideas. And I think it has a tremendous potential, actually, maybe not to be a driver for democracy, as my title suggested. I added a question mark, if you noticed. But really, I think people are excited and interested in these questions, and food democracy is going to demand of us a greater level of participation. It's going to require a greater level of economic cooperation than we're used to. And there's some really neat things happening in that realm. Instead of businesses competing with each other, developing strategic partnerships that are win-win, that are actually grounded in values that we might all share. So for me, I don't think, buying local is the answer to all these things. But it is a place to start, a place to stand right here, an entry point for building efficacy and a sense of creativity and hopefully in the long run resilience as we move forward. So, I didn't mean to do that. I was going to end with my quote from Wendell Berry. He was up there. Yeah, I was probably talking about something else. Sorry about my slides here. Somebody. You think? I don't know. This prospective graduate student came to visit the other day, and he sat in on my class, and he said, "I hear you're very expressive. Do you think it's safe to sit next to you?" I was like, "What do you mean?" So thanks so much for your attention. I'm happy to talk with you all.
Okay, so as usual, Jay and I are going to get the mics and take some questions. There's one right over there, Jay.
Nobody here from the old left that wants to challenge me? The old left, because the old left would say, you're crazy, Local food, these movements, they're not going to transform global capital. Yeah, Chris.
I guess what I found most depressing, and some of those statistics were overwhelming, looking at developing countries where you see the fastest population growth and probably, I don't know, but the most severe degradation of the soils, how do we keep up with it? It's one thing to talk about Missoula and an activist community and an affluence that allows us to preserve some things, but it seems like we're really in a downhill spiral. It'd be tough to...
No, I appreciate that question because it's an excellent question. And there are people much smarter than I, including like Miguel Altieri, who was here on campus last fall, who is one of the leading agroecologists in the world, but in the United States, he's at UC Santa Cruz. And he and others have done work to show that if you can develop agroecosystems that are based on principles like diversity and careful crop rotation and using composting, mostly traditional, what we might think of as organic methods, they're doing this around the world. And that you can actually increase production per unit of land through some of these mechanisms without depleting the soil. So we have to rebuild some of these systems in the developing world, and they're doing this. If you want to learn more about it, go to Food First's website and look at the work of their director, Eric Holt Jimenez, who studied and worked with, they call it the Campesina project in Mexico, where they're literally trying to rebuild sustainable systems among peasants. It may be the only way out, actually. The other thing that's happening around the world is increased urban agriculture. It's not just hippy-dippy Missoula. In fact, a lot of people in the world are fed through urban agriculture. And what Linda didn't mention was after I went to Kenya, I decided I needed to stay home and focus on the belly of the beast. So my work is not international, but I'm not convinced I'll say, that more technology, more capital-intensive production is the way out. It really doesn't look to me that we're going to, solve world hunger through that. And as I said, we already have enough food to feed everybody, but we're not doing it. So the other piece, of course, is population growth, and the key to population growth is educating women. And that's, something that is another way to address this issue. And there are signs that that's, stabilizing in certain parts of the world. So not a complete answer, but excellent question.
Okay, my question was, La Via Campesina protests corporate control over food systems, among other things. And I was wondering what the top 3 things that make social movements like this effective.
Ooh, great question. A lot of meetings. Actually, there's a great article that came out. I can't remember the guy's name of it. It's called The 4 Habits of Highly Successful Social Movements. And it came out around the time when Occupy Wall Street in the fall was getting a lot of attention in the press, and somebody asked this guy who's a veteran organizer what he thought. And that is actually one of the things that it takes, right? It takes not just anger and people getting out into the street. It takes building organizations that are sustainable over the long term in and of themselves. It takes building and developing new leadership. Oh, I'm not going to give you 3 things. I'll give you more than that. It takes financial resources to support good work. And I think, I think it takes youth. That's it. We're at a university. It takes youth, right? I mean, I find that a lot of my students, come to this work with a tremendous passion. They don't necessarily come to it with a farm background or anything. They don't have sort of all the classic barriers come up for them about why we can't do something, right? They'll say, hey, you know what? Let's create a farm out at the Tom Roy Youth Home. Okay, let's go do it. And they do it. And it's cool, and it's changing the lives of 4 kids or 5 kids that live there, right? That's small in a sense, but go back to the Howard Zinn quote, right? It's those small acts, actually, that may ultimately, be a marvelous victory in the end. So, I don't know, who wants to add something else? Bryony, what makes a social movement successful? She's too brain dead. She's been at a meeting.
How about Jeff in the back?
I mean, it takes vision. Movements are built on vision, right? We remember Martin Luther King's favorite quote, or everybody else's favorite quote from Martin Luther King, and I have a dream, right? He's like setting up the next generation. He's not saying, I'm going to do this all by myself. He's setting up the next generation to take that vision forward. And, I like to say movements move, and I think that's part of it, is bringing in young people and that new juice, if you will. So.
Neva, right back here in the middle.
Hi.
Hello. First of all, thank you for your comment tonight, and I also want to thank you for your inspiring academic work. A few years ago, I was having a conversation with one of your former students about this problem of disappearing agricultural land. And we observed that it wasn't all going away. A lot of it was being disguised as lawns. Mm-hmm. And we started a group called 1,000 New Gardens.
Yeah, thanks.
And I want to thank you because your students, year after year, come out and help Missoulians dig up their backyards and create gardens. Can you comment about this whole notion that we have about needing a green organic carpet in our backyards?
Yeah, great question. I'm not sure I have anything profound to say about lawns, other than mine is really muddy right now. and I only have a little patch, and I move my chicken tractor around it all summer long, so it's really pasture. But I live over near the Dairy Queen, so it's a very small pasture. But thanks, and I appreciate your leadership with 1,000 New Gardens. It's really a tremendous organization. This is a group where folks will come out, and if you want to get rid of your lawn, they'll come and help and spend the day and dig it up for you. And a lot of youthful power, and they still have good backs. So, and they have a lot of fun doing it too. But I will say, because we actually have heard this concern from a lot of the development community about, well, we can create this subdivision, but people will still have land, right? Because one of the slides I jumped over shows the increasing residential footprint. And they'll still have land, and maybe they'll garden, and they could even get 1,000 New Gardens to come into the new subdivision and so on. And the problem is what we've seen is a profound fragmentation of our agricultural landscape. And Jim, you might remember this figure, but there are relatively few parcels of agricultural land left in the county that are bigger than 40 acres. Now, you can make a good living. In fact, some of my farming friends in eastern Montana would be blown away to know what kind of living some of my friends in this area make on very small acreages. And yet, when you start talking about livestock production, or even if we brought grain production back to Missoula County, you need a little bit more of those larger pieces. So I think this is something, not your argument, but the development community's argument that they're creating sort of, the Jeffersonian dream of small farmettes. And I kid you not, this is a very real argument, and we watched some, a subdivision proposal recently where, that was the basis of their argument, because they knew we were going to come in and say this is all prime farmland, and so their whole thing was, oh, we're doing this to increase gardening and the like. I'm giving a little short shrift to their argument, but you can see where it goes. So it was very elegant. So, Jim, do you want to comment on that? Jim Cusker is my friend here, and he comes to these series all the time, and he and I have worked on farmland issues for years now, and he worked on them many years before me. I've learned a tremendous amount from him.
Well, David is certainly correct in that there's a very small amount of highly productive agricultural land in Missoula County in the first place. 3% of the total acreage in Missoula County is composed of prime soils. That's being decimated at an extremely rapid rate. And Neva just mentioned the number of farms in Missoula County that are 40 acres or larger now. It's much less than 1%, much less than 1% of that total 26,000 plus acres that existed previously.
I have a couple. One, how do you keep the deer out of those gardens?
Good question. I have a pretty good sized fence in my backyard. And I have a lot of deer in my front yard. It's a really interesting question, and I have a graduate student in one of my classes right now who's doing her research project on urban deer and wondering whether we should do something like Helena has done or something. Maybe if you want to be interviewed by her, you can let me know. But fencing obviously is the only.
Yeah. Well, come up to our house and we'll give you one. Second question, and I probably have missed something. What department are you in, and what is your main thrust in your teachings?
Thanks. That's a good question. I'm in the Environmental Studies program, which is housed in, if the dean's still here, it's housed in the College of Arts and Sciences. The Environmental Studies program focuses on, it sounds quaint to say it, but we try to train the next generation of environmental leaders, and we try to do it in a way that is going to make them be as thoughtful and as innovative as they can be. My background is, all of my degrees are in environmental studies, and so I'm a devout generalist. You know, Linda started out, she said I was an oddity on the university, and I thought, well, there could be lots of ways she could go with that. But
It can be good or bad.
yeah, yeah. I think that environmental problems and the social and economic problems that we face demand an interdisciplinary perspective. They're not simply technical. If they were, we would probably have solved them. So they aren't simply technical. My doctoral work was in environmental studies, but I worked with an agricultural sociologist, which is a field that you may or may not have heard of, but rural sociology is part of that. And I teach courses in community and environment research methods and contemporary food systems. And the last thing I'll say is that with our graduate students, I really try to work on creating projects where we are contributing to this larger effort of building this local food system that I was just barely got to talking about at the end here. You know, 4 of my graduate students started the Farm to College program as a class project in 2003. You know, so that's just one example. But there are many, and what's exciting for me is to see them go on and create a whole host of other projects. It's kind of a ripple effect. Many of them are farming, some of them are working in extension, some of them are working in the policy arena. And what we try to do in the course of teaching them research methods or those kinds of things, or how to work you know, in community, is to actually have their work be relevant. And I could go on and on about all the many projects that they've done that have contributed to this. They're very visible in this food movement locally, and I'm really, I hate to say I'm proud of them because it's their own work, but I really am very proud of them. So. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks for your talk tonight. I had a question that's kind of broad. I was wondering if you could comment further on the extent that you think the building of people power in the food chain is informing and being informed by other movements for more local and worker control in different industries, and also movements against gender and racial oppression. You touched on it briefly in your speech.
Yeah. Wow. Great question. There's not enough intersection, right? And this is what's why this term food justice keeps popping up is in part because people are pushing the movement, right? Like I said, movements move, right? Movements have as much impact almost by the debates and tensions that occur within them, I would argue, as they do between the so-called movement and its opponent, right? In other words, movements are learning fields, right? Where the kinds of questions you're raising get put on the table, and by golly, you got to deal with it. You know, that's why this issue of food justice is coming up a lot. There's a great book, and that's when I'll do the academic punt and send you to an excellent new book. Very easy read called Food Justice. It's by Robert Gottlieb, and I forget how to say her first name, but her last name is Joshi, Joshi. And they look at a range of food justice movements across the country, and you know, this is happening all over. I mean, they start the book with a discussion of, I forget the name of the group. It's like the Reclaimers or something like this. It's in, it was in New Orleans after Katrina. These kids, high school kids, organized this group to say, we deserve better food. And they actually figured out how to influence the school board and get some changes in their local food system. And these are all people of color, mostly in this group. And it was a tremendous empowering story for these young people. In Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is an old industrial city that's where there's a large Puerto Rican population. They've started organizations like, my Spanish isn't any good, Nuestra Raíces. It's, and I forget what it even translates into. It's because the people were hungry, and they started using these lots, and they knew how to farm, so they started doing it, and they built a strong community base. And they've developed a number of micro enterprises and jobs off of this. It's a really cool story. One of the dangers, I'm not going to do your question justice at all, I can tell. But one of the dangers of the food movement is this, okay, the way it is right now in the United States, is that as much as I appreciate the work of someone like Alice Waters, who's the fabulous gourmet chef in Berkeley, who owns a restaurant called Chez Panisse, and she was one of the first restaurateurs to really start buying, literally out the back door, buying local food from farmers who would come up and sell it to her, really fresh ingredients. That the movement is sometimes associated with folks like her, this very high-end, I call it yuppie chow, right? And this movement will not survive if it's just that. And I think that there's enough evidence around to make the argument that it isn't just that. There are these amazing stories. Hartford, Connecticut has had a food policy council for nearly 30 years. They've been working to bring fresh food into inner city Hartford where there's no supermarkets, because all the white flight went out to the suburbs, and so did the supermarkets. They've been working at it for years. So issues of race and class and are not ignored completely in this movement, but we definitely need to talk about it more. And I'll give you one last local example. The Peas Farm, which I love, right? I did a study of the Peas Farm, which is where students work on the farm for credit, and they produce food for the food bank and for the Poverello Center, as well as a CSA, Community Supported Agriculture. It's like a subscription. And those CSA subscribers essentially, as well as the students in their labor, subsidize the production for the food bank. Yet when I did a extensive survey of food bank clients, a lot of them didn't know where the food was coming from. They didn't know that much about it. And yet, to the surprise of the food bank staff who said they don't care, they actually do care. And a lot of these surveys were like, thank you, for providing fresh produce, because most food banks are giving away crushed Doritos, that Walmart can't sell, and then if they give them away, they don't have to pay the dumping fees for the landfill and so on, right? So, have we reached food justice? No. But we can try, and we can keep raising critical questions like you're raising. See, I told you I wander. See, this is where you're glad I took notes. Yes, hi.
Hi, I just wondered, as I see different parcels of 8 acres, 10 acres, 20 acres, particularly out on, as we all have seen on River Road and now out in Target Range over the years, I've wondered about some of those size. And you were mentioning the Peas Farm. Is there any movement or in groups around here that are particularly trying to obtain some of those larger tracts of land for another farm, for example?
Yeah. Great question. And I'll tell you, we have this idea. And if any of you have land, I'm looking for a fairy godmother. But the Community Food and Agriculture Coalition And one of my graduate students, Brianna Ewart, who's doing her master's thesis on this topic, has been looking into this idea of an incubator farm. And the easiest way for me to describe it is to describe the one that's in Burlington. It's on the edge of Burlington. You can actually bike there on the bike path. And what they do is they lease land. They have land. It's owned by a nonprofit. And they lease portions of it to beginning farmers, to incubate farmers. And they do it because they're nonprofit. They can do it at a rate that, isn't about making a big return. The farmers share equipment, so they don't have to make this big capital expense right when they get at the get-go. They provide business training, and market analysis to help these folks develop their markets. And the idea is at some point they spin off and they find their own farms. And so we think this would be a really neat idea and to do here. And because we have, it's funny because I used to live in eastern Montana, so I still have a lot of friends out there. And they're just shocked when I tell them, I have these students, they want to farm. They're like, really? They can come out here and farm, but we have a number of the beginning farmers in this area, and some have been part of the Peas farm or not. Some others are moving in, which is terrific too. We need a way to incubate these new farmers to help them get going and then help them find land that they can afford. And we figure that once they do this, if they go through this incubation process, right, and you show that you've got your business plan down, that you can actually make some money, that you know how to farm, then you'll be more likely to get credit. And so it's kind of neat because a few parcels have been brought to our attention as possibilities for this. So that's another idea. And I think I think we need more farmers. I've worked a lot on the market development end. I mean, the biggest obstacle for the University of Montana's Farm to College program is not that they don't want to buy more local food. Mark Leparco is a hero. He wants to buy more. But where we fall down is on that production end. And, we can't have a local food system. We can't have a vibrant farmers market without farmers and farmland. And you know what else we can't have? We can't have food for the future because those bummer statistics I talked about at the beginning, to me, what they say is, okay, what I can do is try to influence where I am. I'm done with trying to tell other people how they should, develop their agricultural system. And I really, I think that for the long-term security of this community, we really need to adopt policies that will mitigate, not eliminate, but at least mitigate the loss of farmland. And if you will, you can consider writing a letter about a subdivision that's proposed right now. I'm going to get in trouble. Is the dean here still? Hopefully. All right. Anyway, the Community Food and Agriculture Coalition is a nonprofit organization that would be happy to provide you with information on how to get involved, join the organization. It's a great group, growing organization, and I think we have some reasonable ideas about how we could protect farmland for the future. So.
We'll do just one more question, and we'll wrap it up.
You mentioned briefly the Department of Justice antitrust hearings and investigations, and I heard about that back in 2009, and I was just kind of wondering where it is in the process.
That's a great question, and as I was contacting my friend Kiki Hubbard for some of these seed concentration statistics, she's sent me a piece, which I'd be happy to send to you, with her sort of latest blog on, where that whole process is. But let me just briefly explain what it is. The Department of Justice and the Department of Agriculture, for the first time ever, I think, teamed up to do this investigation of anti-competitive practices, in the food industry. Their primary focus was Monsanto, but they also did. They not only did hearings on seeds, but they also did hearings on beef concentration and several other sectors, and probably dairy, some of the major commodities. And so they, gathered tremendous input. As yet, I don't believe that the Attorney General has done anything, but maybe they need, a little more time.
Okay. Well,
But I can get you that if you want.
if you have more questions, just come on down and ask.
Great. Thanks so much for your attention. I appreciate it.